Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. I never planned on moving into a house with a basement. Actually, I never thought about it at all. The whole concept seemed like something that belonged in an old movie or maybe in the kind of suburban neighborhood that still felt stuck in the 80s. But when I found this place, tucked away in the hills just outside Los Angeles, it was different. It wasn't the sleek modern loft I thought I wanted, but it had a kind of charm that pulled me in. The house was old, maybe early 1900s, with creaky floors and windows that groaned when the wind hit them just right. The hardwood was worn and scratched, the kind of floors you can only get by walking across them for decades. The walls were a dull yellow, like someone had tried to make it sunny, but it ended up just being faded and tired. I liked it, though. It felt lived in. It felt real. I was 28, just coming off a long stretch of renting a place with roommates who never cleaned, and I was ready to finally live on my own. I worked a 9-to-5 job at a marketing agency. My life was simple. I'd wake up at 7 a.m., throw on something semi-professional, grab a coffee, and spend the day in front of a computer screen. There wasn't much excitement. No pets, no relationships, just me and the quiet hum of the city outside my apartment window. That's what I thought I wanted. Stability. Calm. When I saw the house, though, something shifted. It was exactly the kind of place I imagined settling into. It had a garden out front with an old oak tree that looked like it had been there for generations. The backyard had a small cobblestone patio that seemed perfect for barbecues. The only downside? The basement. It wasn't anything too scary at first glance. It was just a room tucked under the house. It didn't even have windows. The door was at the base of the kitchen, and the stairs led down into darkness. The light switch for the basement was down there too, which I thought was strange, but it was such a minor detail, I didn't think about it much. The realtor, a woman named Janet, pointed it out casually as we toured the house. She had that perfect real estate agent smile, always a little too bright. "It's a good space for storage," she said. "Maybe for old furniture or your holiday decorations. You won't even know it's there once you close the door." I nodded, but something about the idea of having a basement in a house so old made me uneasy. I didn't think much of it, though. I was too caught up in the excitement of finally owning my own place. It wasn't until a couple of weeks after I moved in that I first noticed the light. It was around 8 p.m. one evening. I'd just finished unpacking a few more boxes in the living room and had decided to make some dinner. My new kitchen had a nice, old-fashioned feel to it, with deep blue cabinets and black and white checkered floors. I felt comfortable there. Peaceful. I set the pot on the stove, and as I reached for the garlic, something caught my eye. The basement light, dim and yellow, like an old bulb that was on. At first, I just stared at it for a second. I had no memory of turning it on, but it wasn't exactly unusual. It could have been something I did earlier in the day and just forgot. My mind was still preoccupied with settling in. The kitchen was my focus, not the basement. I shrugged it off, finished cooking, and went to bed. But the next night, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch with a book, the sounds of the house creaking around me, when I glanced over at the kitchen door. There it was, the light in the basement, on once again. I stood up, feeling a little frustrated with myself. "I must be forgetting," I muttered aloud, like talking to myself would somehow make it better. I went into the kitchen, made sure the light was off, and went to bed. But even after I turned out the lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it. The basement's light. It felt wrong. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and getting used to my new life. Work was stressful as always, but there was a comfort in being home at night, away from the office noise. I went to bed early and woke up early, finding a rhythm to this new chapter of my life. But every time I passed the basement door, a small voice in my head nagged me. Why is the light on? It started happening more frequently now, and each time it felt a little stranger. I began to notice how quiet the house was when the lights went out at night. There was no hum of traffic outside, like there had been in my old apartment. No voices in the distance, just silence. It wasn't an eerie silence, necessarily, but there was something unsettling about it, almost like the house was waiting for something. One night, a week after I first noticed the light, I went into the basement to investigate. It wasn't like I had to go down there. It wasn't urgent or anything, but I'd been thinking about it too much, and I wanted to finally figure out what was going on. I stood at the top of the stairs and glanced down. The light was on, but it was dimmer than usual, the bulb flickering as though it were struggling to stay lit. My breath caught for a moment. It was strange how something so ordinary could feel so wrong. I reached for the door handle and pulled it open. The smell of old wood and mildew hit me immediately. The basement was cooler than the rest of the house, and the air felt thick as if it were holding its breath. I didn't like it. The stairs were steep and narrow, and they creaked as I descended. At the bottom, the floor was a concrete slab, uneven and rough. There were boxes stacked in the corners, some I recognized from my move, others I couldn't remember ever packing. The basement smelled damp, musty. I flicked the light switch and the room blinked to full brightness, but it didn't make me feel any better. I turned to head back up, but then it happened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. For a split second, I felt something. I can't explain it. Maybe it was my imagination, but I felt watched, like someone was standing in the shadows just outside the light. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The only thing in there besides the boxes were some old shelves, covered in dust and cobwebs. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I turned off the light and hurried back upstairs, the silence of the house closing in around me. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. There was just something about that basement. It felt like it was too quiet, too still, like something was hiding just below the surface. The next few days felt off. There were little things, like the sound of something dragging across the floor when I knew I was alone, or the time I was in the shower and felt like someone was standing in the doorway just out of view. But nothing compared to what happened one night. It was a Friday, and I was exhausted from a long week at work. I was trying to unwind by watching some Netflix, but my mind kept drifting. Every time I glanced over at the kitchen doorway, I saw it. The light in the basement. It was on again. I tried to convince myself I wasn't being ridiculous. It was probably just a coincidence, right? I didn't leave it on. It wasn't even like I was trying to find something strange. But that's when I felt it. That same heavy presence that lingered in the basement, the feeling of someone standing in the dark, watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, switched on the flashlight app, and marched toward the basement door. My hands were shaking slightly, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I opened the door. The light was dim, flickering in the corner, and I stepped down the stairs. The air was cold. I felt my breath catch, but I didn't stop. I needed to get to the bottom of this. When I reached the last step, the light went out. The darkness consumed me. My flashlight didn't help much, just a small circle of light in the otherwise pitch-black space. And then I saw it, just at the edge of the circle. A shadow. It moved. I couldn't even breathe for a moment, standing frozen, staring at it. The light flickered back on, and in that split second, I saw it clearly. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still at the farthest corner of the room. And before I could react, the light went out again. I rushed up the stairs, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my breath, heavy and ragged. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, trembling, and called the police. I didn't know what else to do. Something in that basement was wrong, and I had to know what it was. It felt like forever before the two officers arrived. They were kind, one younger than the other, probably in his early 20s, and the older officer just looked tired. I explained what had been happening, the flickering light, the feeling of being watched, the shadow I saw in the basement. The younger officer offered a smile. "We'll take a look," he said. They both made their way down into the basement with flashlights in hand. I stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the shadows below. I could barely breathe as they moved around the room, their flashlights casting strange shapes against the walls. When they returned, the older officer looked at me with a raised brow. "Nothing down there," he said. "No signs of forced entry, no one hiding. The light switch probably just malfunctioned. It happens. Your mind might have played tricks on you with the flickering light." The younger officer gave me a nod. "Yeah, it's easy to get spooked in a dark place like that. I wouldn't worry about it." I felt a wave of frustration and relief. They didn't get it. They didn't feel what I felt down there. But I thanked them anyway, grateful for their reassurance, even though I knew deep down that something still wasn't right. They left and I locked the door to the basement behind them. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were wrong. But that light, no matter how many times I checked, always flickered on at night. It always pulled me in, beckoning, making my heart race, but I refused to go down again. I stayed away, locked the door, and never looked back. The basement stayed just as it was, dark, empty, and waiting. And I just try to forget that feeling, that thing, down there in the quiet dark, watching, waiting for me to come back. And now, I can't seem to stop hearing the whispers. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear the creak of the stairs. Just a little sound, nothing I can place. But I know what it is. It's waiting. I wasn't looking for a place like this. Honestly, I wasn't even supposed to be in California that summer. But my life had this way of pulling me in directions I didn't expect, and by the time I realized I needed a break from it all, I found myself scrolling through Craigslist for a short-term rental. I didn't know what I was really hoping to find, but something about an old cottage, tucked away in the foothills, caught my eye. It wasn't glamorous. In fact, it looked like the kind of place you'd drive past without a second glance. The photos weren't professionally taken. The description was sparse, just a couple of lines saying it was an old house for rent, quiet, affordable, nature all around, no air conditioning, followed by a number to call. The price was a bargain, especially for the summer in California. So I called, and within an hour, the deal was made. I had just wrapped up a grueling 6 months at my tech job in San Francisco. It had been intense. Long hours, stress, and endless meetings. I worked as a project manager, overseeing a small team working on an app that was supposed to revolutionize the way people interacted with data. The hours were long, and honestly, the work wasn't all that fulfilling. I found myself constantly chasing deadlines, trying to impress a boss who was too busy to ever acknowledge a job well done. That summer, I needed a reset. I wanted solitude. A break from emails and pings, a place where I could turn off and focus on something else. That's when I found the cottage. The place was about 2 hours outside of Los Angeles, nestled in a small town that wasn't much more than a gas station and a few scattered houses. The landscape was beautiful, rolling hills, towering pines, and a clear sky that went on forever. It felt like the kind of place where the world couldn't find you. When I arrived at the house, it was just as the pictures showed. It was small but charming, the kind of house that had seen better days. The white paint on the exterior was peeling, revealing patches of raw wood. The porch was creaky, with a few boards that threatened to give way underfoot. Inside, the furniture was worn but functional, with faded upholstery and old wooden floors that creaked as you walked. The kitchen had that old, musty smell of disuse, but the windows let in a ton of light, and the air had a crispness to it that I didn't even know I needed. What struck me the most, though, was the silence. There was no hum of appliances, no buzzing of lights, no faint sound of traffic in the distance. It was like the house was waiting for something, holding its breath. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. The first night was pretty uneventful. I unpacked a bit, then went for a walk around the property, soaking in the fresh air. The heat wasn't unbearable, but it was warm enough to make me sweat, especially for a city guy used to the fog of San Francisco. I sat on the porch for a while as the sun dipped behind the hills, feeling that familiar weight lift off my shoulders. I was alone, and for the first time in months, I was okay with that. No emails, no calls, no expectations. The house had no air conditioning, which I was fully aware of when I booked it. It was an inconvenience, but nothing I couldn't manage. There were fans in the house, old boxy ones, but they didn't do much. The air felt stale, and as the evening dragged on, it became clear that the heat would be something I'd have to get used to. I had the windows open, hoping for a breeze, but the house seemed to trap the heat, holding onto it like a blanket. I didn't think much of it when I lay down in the small bedroom that first night. The bed was simple, a queen size with an old wooden frame. The sheets were worn, and the pillows weren't the most comfortable, but it wasn't bad. The room itself was small, with the same creaky floors and a large window that faced out toward the hills. The walls were painted a faded blue, and there were a few pictures hung crookedly, an old beach scene, a small still life of a vase with flowers. The ceiling had some cracks in it, and the faintest smell of mildew lingered in the corners. It felt like a place that hadn't seen life in a while. But that night, the silence wasn't as comforting as I thought it would be. As I lay there, drifting off to sleep, I noticed how absolutely quiet the room was. I mean, there was no sound. Not even the usual hum of the fridge or the occasional creak of old houses settling. There was nothing, and that's when I first noticed the breathing. It wasn't loud at first, it wasn't anything to get alarmed about, just a slow, steady sound. At first, I thought it was my own breath, but then I realized it wasn't. It was too slow, too deep, and it wasn't coming from me. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was just settling, or maybe there was something outside, a tree branch brushing against the window, or some critter moving in the attic. But the sound continued, slow, steady, in and out like a person breathing while they slept. I didn't get up, I didn't look around, I just stayed there, trying to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. But the more I focused on it, the more it seemed to fill the room, like the air itself was breathing in rhythm with that sound. I spent the whole night listening to it, trying not to let my mind race. The next morning, I dismissed it. I thought it was the house creaking, or maybe I had just imagined it. It wasn't anything worth worrying about, but that night, the breathing was back, and this time it was louder. I woke up in the middle of the night to the same sound, but it was more pronounced. It was coming from just beside the bed, and I could almost feel it. The room felt off, heavier, like the air pressure had changed. I felt like something was there, watching me. I held my breath to see if it would stop, but it didn't. It kept going. I tried to tell myself it was just the house again. Maybe the walls were thin and sound was traveling from another room. Maybe it was an animal outside, or maybe I was just imagining things. But the more I thought about it, the less rational it seemed. There was no way something could breathe so steadily with no interruptions. No way it could mimic the sound of a person perfectly. I tried to ignore it for the next couple of days. I spent time outside, walking around the property, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt old, not just in the usual way that old houses feel, but like it had seen too many years, like it had absorbed something, some kind of history that it wasn't willing to let go of. But still, I couldn't put my finger on it. There was no logical explanation. The place was isolated, remote, and ancient, but it shouldn't have been creepy. The air inside was always still, like the house was holding its breath along with me. I would lie in bed at night, listening for the breathing. Sometimes it was faint, and sometimes it was right there, loud and clear, just at the edge of my awareness. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to move. And then one night, it moved closer. I woke up again, and the room was suffocatingly still. The moonlight from outside cast long shadows across the floor. I lay there, wide awake, listening. At first, it was faint, but then there it was again, the slow, steady breath, in, out, in, out. I could feel it. It was in the room with me, and this time it was closer. The weight of it pressed down on me, thick like the humidity outside. It was no longer just the sound. I could feel it like something was standing next to the bed, something real. My heart was racing, but I didn't move. I didn't want to move. I held my breath, trying to make it stop, but it didn't. I couldn't hear the walls creak or the wind outside. The only sound was that slow, steady breathing. I kept waiting for it to stop, waiting for it to fade, but it didn't. The seconds stretched on like hours until I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly turned my head just a little so I could see the doorway, the dark hallway beyond, and that's when I saw it. Nothing. There was nothing there. No one in the doorway, no shape, no shadow, but the breathing was still there. Close enough to feel. I couldn't do it anymore. I packed a bag. I grabbed my things in the dark, moving quickly, as quietly as I could, trying not to let my shaking hands betray me. I didn't bother with the lights. I didn't care if I left the house a mess. I couldn't stay there another second. By the time I had everything together, it was past midnight. I didn't wait. I didn't even check the house again. I just left. I drove all the way back to LA that night, shaking. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. What had I just experienced? Was I going crazy? Was the heat messing with my head? I didn't go home right away. I didn't feel safe. I drove straight to a hotel and rented a room for the night. The moment I stepped into the hotel room, I felt the relief wash over me. The silence wasn't too much here. There was nothing to listen for. I didn't go back to the cottage. I couldn't. And I won't. I don't know what was in that house. I don't know if it was a trick of my mind or something else. But I do know one thing. Something was there. And I'll never go back to find out what it was. My name is Eric. I live in a small town in Northern California, and I'm the kind of person who likes to keep to myself. I'm in my mid-30s, work a desk job in a graphic design firm, and I spend most of my free time on the couch scrolling through social media or binge-watching shows. I don't go out much, don't get involved in anything dramatic, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I prefer the simplicity of routine. That routine, however, got completely upended last summer when my aunt asked if I could help clean out my late uncle's house. He had passed away a few months earlier after a long battle with illness, and his place in Sacramento had been sitting untouched ever since. My aunt couldn't bring herself to go through it all. Too many memories, she said. So she called me, the only one in the family with a little time to spare. At first, I was hesitant. It's not like I was especially close to my uncle. He was one of those people who kept to himself, who never seemed interested in family events or even in keeping up with his nephews and nieces. I hadn't seen him in years, and when I was younger, I always thought he was a little odd, but he wasn't a bad guy. Quiet, introverted, and with a dry sense of humor, but harmless. Still, I wasn't exactly excited about cleaning out his house, especially since it meant I had to drive an hour or so to Sacramento every other day. But after a few weeks of ignoring her calls, I finally agreed. She needed help, and I needed something to keep my mind off everything else. The house was a small, nondescript ranch-style home tucked away on a quiet, tree-lined street. You'd never guess it was in a city like Sacramento. This part of town had the feeling of an old neighborhood that had been bypassed by time. The houses were aging, the lawns a little too overgrown. The place had a forgotten, lived-in quality, like it hadn't been touched in decades. When I first walked inside, the air hit me like a wall. It smelled of dust, mildew, and something else, something sharp and old. The kind of smell you get from books that have sat on a shelf for too long. I kicked off my shoes and stood in the entryway, taking it all in. The house was cluttered with old furniture, piles of papers, and knickknacks. Everywhere I looked, there was something. Faded family photos, books that seemed untouched for years, and odd little trinkets that must have meant something to him. But it felt like the house itself didn't quite want me there, as though it were waiting for someone else. I set my bag down and began my work. I was supposed to sort through the things, organize them for donation, and pack up anything my aunt wanted to keep. The first few days were uneventful. I spent hours going through boxes of old clothes, emptying cabinets, and throwing away things I knew no one would ever use. But there was something about the house. It wasn't a creepy feeling, just a strange, persistent sensation that made the hairs on my neck prickle every now and then. A weird heaviness in the air, like I wasn't quite alone. The house had a basement. It wasn't much, just a small set of stairs leading down to a dusty, dimly lit room. The floor was concrete, and there were piles of old furniture stacked along the walls, tables, chairs, an old mattress, and some cardboard boxes filled with who knows what. On the second day, I found something strange. Beneath a pile of old magazines and a dusty sheet, there was a radio. It was a vintage, wood-paneled model, the kind you'd expect to see in an old black and white movie. The knobs were silver and a little tarnished. The speaker cloth was faded and torn in places. It was still plugged in, but it wasn't on. I thought that was odd. My uncle hadn't been a tech guy, not by any means. Most of the house was filled with old furniture and knickknacks from decades ago. Why had this radio been left plugged in? I didn't think much of it at the time, though. I figured it was just another relic of my uncle's time. Maybe he liked listening to it while working on something, but then forgot to turn it off. Whatever the reason, it didn't bother me. I just left it where it was, figuring I'd deal with it later. By the fourth day, I had made a dent in things. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. The house had this oppressive stillness to it. It wasn't that I was scared, but I felt uneasy. The longer I stayed in the house, the more that feeling grew. That night, I decided to stay over. I didn't want to make the long drive back to my apartment after a full day of cleaning. The air in the house was too thick to ignore, but I was too tired to leave. The darkness outside was suffocating, and the only light inside was from a single lamp in the living room. I tried to relax with a book, but the silence was deafening. No hum of a refrigerator, no distant sounds of traffic, just silence. It felt wrong, somehow. At around 2 a.m, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible buzz. I thought I was imagining things, so I ignored it, but the buzzing got louder. It sounded like static on a radio, and it was coming from the living room. I froze, my mind racing. I'm sure it was nothing. I told myself it was just the house settling or some appliance kicking on. But then, after a few more seconds, I heard it. A voice. A low, muffled whisper that seemed to come from the radio in the living room. Eric. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. I could hear my name. It wasn't clear, but it was unmistakable. I didn't want to get out of bed. I really didn't, but I couldn't just ignore it either. The room was so still, the air so thick, that I felt like I might suffocate if I didn't check. I got out of bed and made my way down the hallway. Every creak of the floorboards felt like it echoed in the silence. The living room was dark, except for the glow of the streetlights outside that filtered through the curtains. The radio was sitting there on the coffee table, exactly where I'd left it, but it was on now. The dial was tuned to static, and the voice, my name, kept repeating. Eric? I approached it slowly, like I was approaching a wild animal. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't want to touch it either. I had no idea how it had turned on. I just knew I needed it to stop. I grabbed the cord and yanked it out of the wall. For a moment, there was silence. Sweet, blessed silence. But it didn't last long. The voice came back, louder now, clearer. Eric? I froze. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was in the room. The air seemed to vibrate with it. My hands shook as I backed away from the radio, my mind scrambling to understand what was happening. The voice sounded like it was right behind me. I turned around in a panic, but the room was empty. Nothing but the flickering shadows cast by the dim streetlights. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed the radio and threw it in my bag, hoping that would make it stop. But I could still hear it, that whispering voice. No matter how far I walked away, it followed me. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of prank? But no one else was in the house with me. No one could have done this. And yet I couldn't explain it. The next day I decided I needed to get rid of the radio. It was ridiculous, I knew that, but something in me snapped. It had to go. I packed it up in the trunk of my car and drove to the nearest dump. The entire drive, the voice followed me. Every few minutes I'd hear it faintly, like it was coming from the speakers of the car. When I finally reached the dump, I pulled over, grabbed the radio, and threw it in a bin. But as I stood there, I heard it again. My name. Clear as day. I snapped. I was done. I left the radio there. But when I got back in the car, I checked my phone, and that's when I saw it. A voicemail. No number, just a voicemail. I opened it. The voice was louder now. Eric. It was no longer just static. It was there in my phone, like it was coming from the speaker. I drove home that night, but I didn't go back to the house the next day, and I haven't been back since. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I don't care. Whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting, and I'm not going back to find out. I'll never forget the first time I noticed something was off with the house. It wasn't immediate, not at first, but as time passed, it became impossible to ignore. My name is Kate. I'm a writer, mostly freelance stuff, articles, short stories, some editing. Nothing too glamorous, but it lets me work from home, which is perfect for me. My husband, David, works in tech. He's a software developer. His job's the kind of job that requires long hours, but he enjoys it. It gives him a sense of purpose, or so he says. And then there's Emily, our 10-year-old daughter. She's full of energy, always bouncing around, always talking 1,000,000 miles a minute. We'd been living in a small one-bedroom apartment for years before finally deciding it was time to move. That's when we found the house. It wasn't perfect. What house ever is? It was an old Victorian, one of those grand houses that looked like it belonged in a movie. You know the kind. Tall, narrow, with intricate woodwork and a wraparound porch. The front yard was overgrown with wildflowers, and the backyard was full of old trees that had probably seen better days. It was located in a quiet neighborhood with winding streets and homes spaced far enough apart that we'd have our own little slice of privacy. At first, I was enamored. The house was full of charm. The kind that you can only find in a place that's been standing for over a century. The wooden floors creaked in all the right places. The windows were large, letting in so much natural light, and the rooms, oh, the rooms. There was a parlor with a fireplace that looked like it had been untouched for years, and the kitchen had old-fashioned tiles with intricate patterns. Some were chipped, but I loved them anyway. I could already imagine myself writing in one of the rooms upstairs, staring out the window at the quiet street. We moved in on a Friday. The whole thing was a whirlwind. Boxes everywhere, furniture being shoved into place, Emily running around asking if we could explore the house yet. And explore we did. The first thing that caught my attention, though, was the staircase. It stood at the center of the hallway, grand and imposing, curving up toward the second floor. The staircase was wide, its steps deep and dark, as if the wood had absorbed a century's worth of history. But what I noticed more than anything was the steepness. It was odd, almost unnerving. The angle of the steps made me feel like I was leaning too far forward when I climbed them. I brushed it off at first, maybe it was just the way these old homes were built. But it stuck with me, that steepness. It made the house feel a little less cozy, a little more precarious. Still, we didn't think much of it. That night, we slept in the master bedroom, which was on the first floor. The moonlight spilled through the large windows, casting soft shadows on the walls. The house had a faint, musty smell to it, a mix of dust, old wood, and something earthy. But it didn't bother me. It was the kind of smell that just felt old, like the house had been waiting for us. The first night was quiet, too quiet. The second night, that's when things started to feel strange. It was around midnight when I first heard it. Soft, almost inaudible whispers. It was like a faint rustling in the dark, a voice too low to understand. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it, but it wasn't loud enough to be real. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself, or just the house settling. Houses creak, after all. But then it came again. This time I could hear words, not clear at first, but then they became more distinct. 1, 2, 3, 4. The counting. I sat up in bed, my heart skipping a beat. I could still hear it, the soft murmurs of someone counting the steps, each number spoken in a calm, almost methodical voice, as though whoever was counting wasn't in a hurry. The sound came from somewhere above me, from the direction of the staircase. I turned to David, who was sound asleep next to me. "David," I whispered, shaking him gently. "Do you hear that?" "What's wrong?" he mumbled, barely awake. "Listen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's counting the stairs." He sat up now, his brow furrowed, clearly not sure if I was just imagining it. We both lay there in silence, listening. The counting continued, growing slightly clearer. It was coming from the stairs. I was sure of it. David, always the skeptic, told me it was probably just the house settling. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was the floorboards expanding and contracting, but I knew it wasn't that. The sound was too precise, too deliberate. It wasn't random. It was as if someone who wasn't us was walking up the stairs, counting each step as they went. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept listening, waiting for the counting to stop, but it never did. Eventually, I must have drifted off, but when I woke up the next morning, the memory of it was still fresh in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with those stairs. Over the next few days, the whispers continued. I didn't mention it to David again. I thought maybe I was just imagining things, but then Emily started asking about it. "Mom," she said one afternoon as she was playing with her toys in the living room, "who's counting the steps?" I froze. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "I heard someone counting last night. I couldn't sleep because they were so loud." She paused and looked up at me. Is it a ghost?" I smiled nervously. "No, honey, it's just the house settling. Nothing to worry about." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I stood at the foot of the stairs, watching the darkness. The house was so still. The only sound, the occasional creak of wood or the rustling of trees outside. I was determined to figure out what was going on, so I started to climb slowly. One step, then another. The stairs creaked beneath me, but there was nothing unusual about that. Just the house being old. When I reached the top, I paused. I didn't hear anything. No whispers, no counting. It was as if the house had fallen silent. I turned around, ready to go back down, but then I heard it. 5. The voice was so close, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned, but no one was there. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I looked down the stairs. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there with me. I quickly descended, my feet moving faster than they should have. That was when I first realized it wasn't just the counting. Someone was behind me. I told David about it the next morning, but he brushed it off, telling me I was just tired from all the moving. But I could tell something was off with him too. He was always a little on edge. He started staying up later than usual, working from his laptop in the living room instead of retreating to the office like he used to. He said he couldn't concentrate with the noise from the house, the creaking, the whispering, the counting. One day, I decided to take a good look at the stairs. I'd been so caught up in everything else, I hadn't really taken the time to examine them closely. They were steep, yes, but they weren't crooked or worn down. There were no signs of decay. Still, the steepness felt wrong. My eyes traced the wood grain, the worn patches from years of use. But then, something caught my eye. There, near the bottom, the last step before the landing, there was something odd about it. A slight gap between the wood and the wall, just enough to make you think there was more space there than there should have been. I couldn't stop thinking about that gap. It nagged at me. So one evening, after dinner, I decided to count the steps again. I made my way up slowly, counting each step as I went. 12. There were 12 steps, but when I turned around and started back down, something was wrong. 13. I froze. There were 13 steps going down. I checked again. The last step wasn't right. It was as though the staircase had changed. I went back up, careful this time, counting every step on the way up. 12. Just like before. But when I went down, there was always one more. 13. I was no longer imagining things. I was certain. There was something wrong with those stairs. That night, I refused to use the staircase after dark. David still didn't believe me, of course. He said it was just the layout of the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked past the stairs, I could feel it. Something was waiting for me. Something was always there. I don't know what happened or why it happened, but I stopped using the stairs after dark. David would have to go up and down for me if I needed anything from upstairs. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me every time I stood near that staircase, as though it was alive, as though it had a memory of its own. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I'll hear the whispers again. The counting. Always counting. And I can't help but wonder, how many steps are there, really? I've always been someone who values peace and quiet. Maybe that's why I moved to the small apartment in the first place. Cheap rent, a bit off the beaten path, nestled in a quiet corner of Los Angeles. No fancy amenities, no loud neighbors, just a simple space to call my own. It was perfect, or so I thought. I'd just gotten a new job, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I worked as a copywriter for a small digital marketing firm. My days were filled with the usual: drafting content, proofreading, adjusting websites, and chasing deadlines. It wasn't anything to write home about, but it was steady. I just left my last apartment, a cramped, noisy studio in a building that felt like it was falling apart, and I was desperate for some peace. So when I came across this place, a one-bedroom unit tucked behind an old two-story house, I didn't hesitate. The price was right, and the landlord seemed nice enough. His name was Mr. Jensen, and he was an older man, probably in his late 60s. He looked a bit frail, hunched slightly as if the weight of years had worn him down. He spoke slowly, with a dry sense of humor, and when he handed me the keys, I thought, this is it. This is the fresh start I've been looking for. I didn't think to ask too many questions about the apartment's history. Mr. Jensen mentioned that the place had been vacant for a while. The previous tenant had moved out abruptly, though he didn't elaborate on why. I figured it was just one of those things. Everyone had their reasons for moving on. The apartment itself was modest, but it had a certain charm. The hardwood floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored the space, each step echoing in the emptiness. The walls were a faded cream color, and the air smelled faintly of dust and age. The kitchen was small but functional, with a tiny, chipped counter and a refrigerator that hummed loudly in the corner. I remember the living room best. The window overlooked a narrow alley, and sunlight barely filtered through the grime on the glass. The walls were lined with old wooden bookshelves, some empty, others filled with dusty books and knickknacks left behind by previous tenants. In one corner there was a large armchair, an old, worn-out thing with fabric that had long since faded from red to a dull pink. It sat in front of the only light in the room, a small lamp with a cracked shade. There was a cozy, almost melancholic feel to the place, like it was waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. I spent the first few days unpacking, setting up my life in this new space. My job kept me busy during the day, but when I came home at night, I found myself alone with my thoughts. I couldn't help but think about how quiet it was, how still everything felt. The air didn't move, the floorboards didn't creak with every step, and even the street outside seemed muffled, as though the world was being held at arm's length. On the third day, I noticed something odd. In the kitchen, mounted on the wall next to the door, was an old-fashioned landline phone. I hadn't noticed it when I first moved in, but there it was, sitting there, its coiled cord draped neatly beside it. The phone looked like it came straight out of the 1980s, beige, with a bulky receiver and a rotary dial that was barely visible through the years of grime that had built up on it. It wasn't plugged into anything, just hanging there on the wall, an odd fixture in an otherwise modern kitchen. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was an old phone, probably left behind by someone, but I didn't see the harm in it. It didn't work after all. When I saw Mr. Jensen later that day, I asked him about it. "Oh, that old thing?" he said, his eyes flicking toward it. "It hasn't been connected for years. No one's used it for a long time. It's just there." His voice trailed off as if he were unsure of how to explain it. "The phone line was disconnected long ago. It's not good for anything. Just a relic, I guess." He chuckled awkwardly, but I could tell he wasn't entirely comfortable talking about it. His eyes darted back to the phone, then quickly back to me, like he was trying to downplay it. Maybe I was imagining it, but something about the way he spoke made me uneasy. Still, I let it go. It was just an old phone. What harm could it do? Days passed and I settled into my routine. Work, home, dinner, repeat. The apartment felt like a sanctuary, a quiet retreat from the chaos of the city. I didn't really expect anything unusual to happen. That was until the first time the phone rang. It was late, around 10 p.m., when I heard the sharp ring of the phone. It was faint at first, as if coming from far away, but there was no mistaking it. The phone on the kitchen wall was ringing. I froze, staring at it. My mind raced. The phone wasn't connected. It couldn't be ringing. I got up slowly and walked to the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The phone was just sitting there, still hanging on the wall. The cord swayed slightly, almost as if it had been moved by someone, but I hadn't heard any footsteps. There was no one there. I waited for the sound to stop, but it rang again. One single, crisp ring. And then, silence. I stood there for a long time, not sure what to do. My eyes kept drifting back to the phone. Was I hearing things? I had to be. I shrugged it off, convinced it was just a figment of my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night, it rang again. This time, I walked over to it. I didn't pick it up, but I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. The phone rang once more. I stared at it, and then, finally, I turned and left the kitchen, unable to explain what had just happened. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the phone. Every time I heard a creak in the floor, I wondered if it was the sound of someone moving toward it. The ringing became a nightly occurrence. Every few hours, I would hear it. It didn't matter if I was in the kitchen, the bedroom, or the living room. It always seemed to come from the wall. But no one was ever on the other end. No voice. No explanation. It wasn't until one night, about a week after the first ring, that I finally did something I'd been avoiding. I answered the phone. The receiver felt cold in my hand as I picked it up. The line crackled with static, but there was no dial tone. I brought the receiver to my ear and held my breath. At first, I thought I'd heard something, just a whisper, maybe, but then it became clear. Breathing. Slow, steady, and too familiar. It was my own breath. I pulled the phone away, my pulse racing, my skin crawling. But the breathing didn't stop. I could still hear it, echoing in my ears, my own shallow gasps, like I was standing there in the room, listening to myself. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't explain it. I slammed the receiver down, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was going on? The days that followed were filled with tension. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. The phone would ring, always once, always in the dead of night. And when I answered, there would only be breathing. It was as if something or someone was waiting for me to pick up. I started to feel paranoid, like I was being watched. The apartment, which had once felt like a peaceful retreat, now felt like a trap. One night, the whispers began. I had just finished dinner, and as I was cleaning up, the phone rang again. My hands trembled as I reached for the receiver, but this time the whispers were different. They were low, muffled, and indistinct, like a conversation just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were coming from the phone. Then, just as I thought I heard something familiar, I swore I heard my name. I dropped the phone, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I just heard. Was I losing my mind? Why was this happening? The next night, it happened again, only this time the whispers were coming from everywhere. They filled the apartment, not just the phone. I could hear them in the kitchen, in the living room, behind the door to the bathroom. There were whispers in the walls, in the corners of the ceiling. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if someone was desperate to get my attention. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things, left the apartment in the middle of the night, and never looked back. I moved out of Los Angeles completely, to a small town up north where I thought I'd be safe. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, or the silence in my new place is too thick, I hear it. A faint ring coming from somewhere far away. And I wonder if the phone ever stopped ringing at all. I never thought I'd end up in a house like this. In fact, when I first moved to California, I wasn't exactly planning on buying a house. I'd always been the kind of person who bounced from apartment to apartment, never really putting down roots anywhere. But this time was different. I had a good job offer, an office position at a small marketing firm in Santa Monica, and I figured maybe it was time to settle down, start fresh. The job was everything I needed at the time. It was comfortable, low stress, and paid just enough for me to live relatively worry-free. I didn't have to think about bills too much. But living in an apartment meant constantly dealing with noisy neighbors and the cramped feeling that came from having to share a space with others. I wanted something that was mine, even if it meant taking on a mortgage. I didn't mind the idea of having a place to call my own, as long as it was close enough to work and didn't cost an arm and a leg. That's when I found this house, a small two-story home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Los Angeles. It was built in the 1960s, with a few quirky details that made it stand out. The hardwood floors had seen better days, and the walls were painted a soft shade of yellow that probably used to be bright and inviting, but now felt a little dingy. Still, it had potential. And when I walked through the door, I could feel the history of the place. It had the kind of charm that older homes have. Those beautiful oak beams that ran across the ceilings, built-in bookshelves lining the living room walls, and a grand fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was definitely a fixer-upper, but I figured a coat of paint and some new furniture would do wonders. I moved in on a Friday after signing all the paperwork and getting the keys. The first few days were filled with the usual chaos of unpacking, boxes everywhere, furniture scattered around, and me trying to figure out where to put all my things. I was excited, but there was a sense of unease lingering in the back of my mind. I had lived in enough places to know that no house was perfect, but something about this place just felt off. It wasn't the house itself, necessarily. It was more of a feeling I couldn't shake. The first night I went to bed exhausted. I'd had a long day of hauling boxes and arranging furniture, and I was more than ready to crash. I had my dog Lucy with me, my golden retriever who had been my companion for years. She was as sweet as they come, gentle but always protective when something felt wrong. She didn't seem to mind the house at first, but I noticed that when we were both alone in the evening, she would get a little jumpy. She'd stare at the hallway and pace around, like she was hearing something I couldn't. But the real trouble started the next day. I was putting some of my kitchen stuff away when I first noticed the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was definitely there, an earthy scent, like wet soil, mixed with something faintly sweet. At first, I thought maybe it was just old wood, or perhaps the house had been sitting empty for too long before I moved in. I shrugged it off and opened a few windows, thinking the fresh air would help. But when the sun started to set and the temperature dropped, the smell got worse. I remember it so clearly. By the time I had finished unpacking, it was dark outside, and the house felt colder, even though I had the heat running. The smell was stronger now, more pervasive. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was persistent, like something was hiding just out of sight, and no matter how much I opened the windows, it wouldn't go away. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but there was definitely one room where it seemed worse. The room at the end of the hallway. It was an odd room, almost like a forgotten space. The door was slightly off-center from the rest of the rooms, and when I first looked inside, I could see faded floral wallpaper peeling off the walls. The floors were covered in an old carpet, stained in places from years of wear. It didn't look like a room anyone had used in a while, but it wasn't the kind of room I was eager to spend time in anyway. When I opened the door to air it out, the smell immediately hit me. It was subtle at first, but strong enough to make my stomach turn. The earthy scent was now mixed with something faintly sour, almost like something had been left out in the sun for too long. I figured it was just mold, maybe some old water damage from years ago. The house was old after all. No big deal. Still, there was something about it, something off. The air in that room felt thick, almost heavy. It wasn't like other rooms in the house. When I stepped in, the floor creaked under my weight. The walls felt closer than they should have, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than usual. I decided to just leave it alone for the time being. There were plenty of other things to do, and I didn't want to get too fixated on a room that hadn't seen any use in years. That night, Lucy started acting strange. She had always been calm around the house, but now she wouldn't stop pacing. She wouldn't sleep, just kept walking in circles. her eyes fixed on the hallway. At one point, she stood at the end of the hall, her tail tucked between her legs, staring at the door of the room at the end of the hall. She was completely still, like she was waiting for something. I called her over to me, but she refused to move. That's when I started to get nervous. I mean, dogs don't act like that without reason, right? "Lucy, come on," I said gently, trying to coax her to the living room with me. But she just kept staring at the door, her body tense. I thought maybe it was just the smell making her uneasy. Maybe it was affecting me more than I realized, too. The next few days were a blur of more unpacking and cleaning, but each time I entered that room, the smell seemed to get worse. I tried everything, opened all the windows, sprayed air freshener, even lit candles, but nothing helped. The smell was always there, lurking in the corners of that room, making the air feel stagnant. It wasn't just the room, though. It started to feel like the entire hallway was affected, like the house itself was somehow holding on to it. Lucy refused to go anywhere near that room. Even when I tried to take her out the back door, she'd go out of her way to avoid the hallway entirely, almost as if she was terrified of something. It wasn't like her. She was normally so easygoing, but this different. A week after I moved in, I started noticing other things. Little things. A flicker of light in the corner of my eye, the sound of something scraping against the floorboards at night, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But it wasn't until that one night, late at night, 2 a.m., that everything escalated. I was just about to fall asleep when the smell hit me again, stronger than ever. It was so overwhelming that I woke up, sitting straight up in bed, gasping for air like I'd just run a marathon. My throat burned, my eyes stung, and then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched scraping sound coming from the hallway. I froze, unable to move, my breath shallow. Lucy was up now too, sitting at the edge of the bed, her body stiff. She was staring at the door, growling softly. It wasn't like her at all to growl unless she sensed danger. The sound of scraping continued. I knew it was coming from that room. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I had to go see what was in that room. But as soon as I stood up, Lucy barked sharply, her voice desperate, as if pleading with me not to go. My stomach twisted with dread, but I couldn't stop myself. Something in me urged me to open that door. I walked down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to the room was slightly ajar, as it had been before. The air around it felt thick, almost suffocating, like the house was holding its breath. When I opened the door fully, the smell slammed into me like a punch to the gut. My eyes watered, and I immediately gagged. The room was shrouded in darkness, but I could still make out the outlines of the old furniture. A dusty armchair, a small side table with a lamp that hadn't worked in years, and the faded wallpaper that had been peeling away from the walls. But there was something else now. Something I hadn't seen before. Near the center of the room, the carpet was disturbed. It was as if something had been moved underneath it, pushing the fibers out of place. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slowly bent down to pull back the carpet. Beneath it, the floorboards were scratched and dented, gouged as if something had been trapped there for a long time. My fingers trembled as I touched the wood, feeling the deep indentations. The smell was unbearable now, mixing with something else, something metallic, almost like blood. I don't know why I kept pulling at the floorboards. Maybe it was because I had to know what was underneath, or maybe it was because I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been trapped there for far too long. When I finally managed to pry up a few of the boards, I found a small hole. It was filled with dirt, clumpy, wet, and thick. But there was something more, something alive. My hands shook as I stumbled back, my breath ragged in my chest. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew I had to get out of that room. I grabbed Lucy, who was now trembling beside me, and I slammed the door shut. I didn't know what had been hidden under that floor, but I knew I'd never go near it again. I haven't been back inside the house since that night. I can't. The smell still lingers in my mind, faint but persistent. It's been weeks, and every time I close my eyes, I see that hole in the floor, and I can't help but wonder what was buried under there, and why was it trying to get out? That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.